Okay, this is the second part of the chapter 14 notes. And this covers more complex inheritance than just Mendel's understanding of dominant and recessive. So, complete dominance is what we've looked at before. The phenotype of the heterozygote is the same as the homozygous dominant. So, if you have this, you're going to see this. Incomplete dominance is different because neither allele is completely dominant. So that means that the heterozygous is going to be somewhere in between the two parents. It's only really going to affect the differences being in the heterozygous. For example, in red snapdragons, when you cross a red and a white, you actually end up with a pink flower, with all pink. And so between red and white is pink. You kind of think of this as a incomplete, as a blending of the two. We write these a little bit different. Usually the way we write these are, we look at color, that's the trait, and we do red, and then we do color white. And then anytime you see color red with color white, you end up with pink. It's going to affect the phenotype. It doesn't affect how we conduct the Punnett squares or how we calculate them. It just affects what we're actually looking at. Is it red? Is it white? Is it pink? Because now instead of having two phenotypes, we now have three phenotypes. We have two phenotype options, red, white, or pink. Sometimes I will just skip this all together and I won't put that base there and I'll just do red and white. And then I know that this is going to equal red and this is going to equal pink and this is going to equal white. And I just do it for simplicity. But most often when you see it written somewhere, you're going to see it like that. The superscript. Another one is codominance. That's when the two alleles each affect the phenotype. So an example here is roan cattle. So you will see actually red and you will see physically white. It's not a blending like incomplete dominance, because if that were the case, you'd have a pink cow. And we don't have a pink cow. We actually have red hairs and we have white hairs. So co-dominant means like co means together. They are both dominant. You will see both of them in the physical phenotype. The relationship between the dominance and the phenotype depends on what level you are observing the phenotype. So, for example, here with Tay-Sachs, brain cells of a child cannot metabolize certain lipids because of crucial enzymes. A crucial enzyme does not work properly. Lipids accumulate in the brain cells, and the child suffers from seizures, blindness, and degradation of motor skills, motor and mental performance. That occurs within a few years. It's a really sad disorder if kids are born with it. At the organismal level, it is a recessive trait. That means overall in the organism, it's going to be seen as recessive. It's not going to be passed down from a parent having it to a child, which kind of makes sense because they don't live very long. The activity level of the enzyme is heterozygous, meaning that it's incomplete because in the heterozygous, it's incomplete because these individuals don't have as many symptoms. So if they have, so we'll call it T, if they have this, they are actually, that's considered incomplete because these individuals don't have as many symptoms. They're not going to have all of this. They're going to have some of it, but not all of it. And then at the molecular level, it's going to be codominant because they actually produce equal numbers of normal and malfunctioning enzymes. So when they have this, they have normal enzyme, malfunctioning enzyme, and they have equal amounts of that. And so, well, because they have equal numbers of normal, and that means that they have less of these symptoms here. Okay. So there's different levels when we talk about it being incomplete dominance or codominance. It really just depends on what level you're looking at it. As far as inherited, it's a recessive inherited trait because if you are like this, you're going to be totally normal. And if you're going to be like this, or you're going to be like fairly normal, like you're going to have reduced symptoms, you're probably not going to die within a few years. But here, this is going to be fatal. Okay, so it just depends on how you're looking at it, whether we consider it incomplete codominance or just simple dominant recessive with some traits. I want you to understand that dominant does not mean predominant in the population. Just because a trait is dominant does not mean most of the population has that trait. For example, 1 in 400 children in the U.S. are polydactyl, which is actually controlled by a dominant gene, which means that most people in the population are homozygous recessive. And we'll use P for this. So polydactyl means you have this or this, you will be polydactyl. And if you don't know what that means you have extra fingers or toes. But most people are actually little p in the population. Multiple alleles, one gene is controlled by many different alleles. An example of this is ABO blood group. So we write it kind of like an incomplete dominant, the superscript I, or sorry, the main letter I, and then we write as a superscript the different options of blood. A and B are carbohydrates that are found on the surface of red blood cells. Depending on the combination, you could actually have blood type A, you have blood type B, you could have AB, or you could have O. So this might kind of give you a clue here. A and B are both dominant because together, when you have both A and B carbohydrates, you end up with AB blood. O blood means you have none of the carbohydrates. So O is actually the most recessive. So it's actually exhibiting a couple different things here. Codominant, dominant and recessive, and there are many different options. And how you combine them will depend on what blood type you have. So here's kind of a picture of that. Antigen A, antigen B, codominant AB, and then none for O. And these are the genotypes you could possibly have with each of those blood groups. O, only one option, AB only one option, but there's a couple different options with A or D because if you have that recessive, you're going to have the dominant genotype for those. And you would have blood group A or B. Pleiotropy, many genes have multiple phenotypic effects. Example, cystic fibrosis in peas, and the gene that affects flower color also affects the color of the coating on the outer surface of the seed. So a single gene actually having to do with multiple traits. Epistasis is a phenotypic expression of a gene at one locus alters that of a gene at a second locus. An example of this is in Labrador retrievers. Black coat color is dominant to brown, which is chocolate, but a second gene determines whether there will be any pigment at all. And so we'll call that E. So if they have a dominant E, then they're going to have a pigment, and then the coat color will determine if it's black or brown. If they have this, it doesn't matter what the pigment color is, they're not going to have any pigment at all because this gene determines whether there is or is not pigment. Gene for pigment is said to be epistatic to the gene that codes for the black or brown pigment. So this gene depends then on what that gene is going to show. So here you go. These two show pigment because they have the dominant E here. It doesn't matter if that's another dominant E or a lowercase e or recessive. It doesn't matter. As long as they have the dominant E, they're going to show pigment. So then if they have this, they'll be black. If they have this, they'll be brown. In this case, it doesn't matter what this is because they are recessive and they have no pigment. So they're going to turn out to be kind of a yellowy or kind of a lighter yellow lab. Polygenic inheritance means that there are two or more genes on a single phenotypic character. Traits like skin color, hair color, eye color have graduations along a continuum. So this is really, really, really hard to predict the offspring for. We just don't know enough about it because there are lots of genes involved in that particular trait. For example, skin color. There's so many genes involved in it that it's really hard. This is usually a big clue that it's a polygenic trait if there are lots and lots of graduations along a continuum. There's lots and lots of options like eye color, hair color, things like that. So here's an example of trying to kind of predict that. There's so many genes here involved that you could get any number of shades. And we don't try to do that. I won't try to make you do anything problem with that. Scientists still don't quite understand it. And then we also have an environmental impact on the phenotype. So it's always a struggle of answering nature versus nurture. Is it about how your environment interacts with you or how you were born with your genes? Many phenotypes actually depend on the environment as well as the genes. We call a norm of reaction a range of phenotypic possibilities due to the environment. So traits like blood group, the norm of reaction has no. expressed because it's only controlled by genes. The environment has no impact on your blood type, okay? This is also termed multifactorial because it has many factors playing an influence on the phenotype. Examples, height. There are some genetic bases for your height, but there's also nutrition that's going to play an impact on your height. IQ, what you learn in school is going to have a lot to do with it, but you're also born with a certain level of ability. Heart disease, what you eat is going to impact your chances of getting heart disease, but you're also going to have some genes you inherit that might make you more likely, and so on and so on. And this one we'll look at here in a second. So the soil, if pH is in this range, these are the colors that these flowers are going to bloom. It's really cool because then you can change the pH of your soil and manipulate what color flowers you want during hydrangea. And then we're going to talk about creating pedigrees. This is what scientists have done and geneticists have done to try to figure out how traits are passed down in families, because you can't really experiment with humans. You can look at families and then try to figure out a pattern that's occurring. Geneticists usually commonly use information from matings that have already occurred. Taking that information, they create something called a pedigree, and from that, then they can decide whether the trait is inherited as a dominant trait, a recessive trait, on an X chromosome, if there's maybe more than one gene involved, things like that. So these are some of the symbols for pedigree. Males are square, females are circle. If they are affected by the trait or the disorder, they're going to be colored. A mating will be with a line between them. The offspring will branch off from there. This will indicate identical twins and non-identical. So identical is showing that they're connected that way. So here is an autosomal dominant pedigree. You'll notice that dad is passing it on straight to the offspring. It's pretty easy. You'll actually have a chance in class to try to figure out what their genotypes are based on the pedigree. It's kind of fun. I think it's like solving a puzzle. I enjoy it. So looking at this one, you'll notice that this parent was affected. But then it doesn't look like, you'll notice it doesn't show up here. So it's probably not going to be dominant, right? Or you probably see it in mom. Kind of think about this as if it was dominant like this, then mom would have to pass this on to all of the children, and they would have to be affected. So that's probably not going to work, right? But this could be recessive, where this is dad, and this is mom, and then mom, all the kids are heterozygous, but then somewhere along the line, maybe he was unaffected, and then he got this, and then married somebody that was like this, and then they produced a child like this. Okay, so you can see that it can be passed on. So this is probably recessive. And notice 2 recessives give yield to all offspring that are affected. Inherited disorders can be recessive or dominant. Most are recessive. Most inherited disorders are recessive. Genes code for proteins that have a function. Typically, disorders are a malfunction of a protein, which makes sense. Individuals that inherit the defective copy often inherit a normal copy as well, and they're heterozygous, and they appear normal, so we call them carriers. That's a big term we use. Many times these disorders are not common in same blood marriages, so consanguineous, I guess is the word that used to be more common in more primitive times when we couldn't travel very far. Because it is more likely both parents are carriers and will pass the trait on to offspring. So you'll see a lot of disorders in families that do some inbreeding. Typically not distributed equally among populations. You'll find populations that have more higher frequencies of certain disorders. If the disorder is lethal before reproductive age, there are likely few affected individuals because they die before they pass on. Reading your textbook about cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease as an example of evolution in humans. This is really kind of cool. I want you to do that. I may have even made that as part of your homework. Dominant disorders are not actually as common. Just because it's inherited dominant does not mean it is common in the population. And Huntington's disease is one that is inherited as a dominant disorder. See if you can figure out who on the show House had Huntington's disease. Multifactorial disorders have a genetic component plus an environmental, and these are some examples of those. Genetic testing and counseling, an individual decision on whether they want to be tested for certain genetic disorders. There's a lot of ethics here. Do you really want to know? Like, for example, Huntington's disease doesn't come up until like your 30s or 40s, and it's really bad, and you go downhill, and you know you're going to have it, and you know you're going to die of it, and it's going to be a really long, painful thing. Do you really want to know that? Some people do, some people don't. Will it affect whether you have children? Because it's dominant, you would pass that on to all of your children. Some people make life decisions based off of genetic testing. Some don't want to know, but then they regret it when they have children and pass that on to them. Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act prohibits discrimination in employment and insurance coverage based on genetic testing. It's still very expensive to get a lot of genetic testing done. Here's some genetic testing we have routinely done for a while. They will do an amniocentesis, which means they're going to pull cells from the amniotic sac of a baby when it's still in the embryo of, or sorry, when it's still in the uterus of a female. Some are really done. PKU, because it's one that has to do with a deficiency in a certain enzyme, I think, and so you have a buildup of a certain amino acid. Anyway, it's done routinely at birth because it's a really easy fix. You just change their diet and they're fine. Down syndrome is another one you can test for amniocentesis. But it's up to parents. Some parents have it. I know when I was pregnant, I had a list of possible genetic disorders I could have my baby tested for before it was born. And I had to make the choice of whether I wanted that done or not. It's really a personal choice. And as we get more knowledge about genetic disorders, it's going to be more common to have more different types available to us. And I think that is finally it.